Hey everyone, this is Aaron from Vanishing Cabinets, and in this video I'm going to be turning these 2x4s into these drawer fronts and cabinet doors. I'm going to go through my step-by-step process all the way from milling down the wood to the different router steps that I took, along with my staining and finishing processes. And at the end I'll talk about my thoughts on building furniture with cheap 2x4 material, so stay tuned to the end. I mean, look at that price, you just can't beat it. So the first step in this process was to resaw each 2x4 into two different thicknesses. So I'm going to have one side be about 7/8 of an inch thick and the other side be about 1/2 inch thick. I'm going to be using the 7/8 side for the frames and the 1/2 inch side for the panels. So don't do that. In that case, I actually didn't have a writhing blade on because I was being lazy. I'd taken it off for some dado cuts and didn't put it back on, so the board pinched on the blade and I got some pretty serious kickback. But have it on now and it's resawing pretty well. Although I'd advise taking more than just 2 passes there. After I got the boards resawn, I am jointing just one face of them and using that flat edge that I just jointed down in the planer and going to plane down the boards to their final thicknesses at 3/4 of an inch for the face frames and 1/2 inch for the panel boards. So then I took the boards back to the jointer where I'm going to flatten one edge of each board, and then I'm going to reference that flat edge against my fence for my table saw, and I'm going to square up all the boards. And then finally I'm going to rip them down to their final widths. So I have 2 different widths here, one's about 2 1/4 and the other's 1 inch. They're going to be for the 2 different size frames I'm building for the drawers. So because this was cheap 2x4 lumber, there's still some bowing and cupping and a few imperfections here and there from knot holes and moisture in the wood, but for the most part things were pretty straight. So I wanted to make these drawer frames a little bit unique, so I used this V-grooving router bit on my router table to route out a couple V-channels in the face of each frame. For the thicker ones I'm doing 2 different channels about 1/2 inch from the edge, and for the skinnier ones I'm doing just 1 channel right down the middle. This is a 30-degree V-grooving bit. And to get those grooves just a little bit smoother, I took some sandpaper, 120 grit, folded it in half and just ran it in each groove for each piece. And in order to get those V-grooves to be continuous all the way around each edge of the face frame, I needed to use mitered cuts instead of traditional rails and stiles. Next routing step was to route out a chamfer. This is a 30-degree chamfer on the inside edges of each piece after I cut them all to length with 45-degree cuts. And I really just kind of eyeballed how much of that chamfer I wanted on the edge so it wouldn't interfere with that V-groove there. So to fit the panels on these face frames, I'm routing out a 1/2 inch rabbet on all the inside edges as well that the panels will sit in. I'm doing it this way instead of having like a 1/4 inch panel in a channel on the inside edges because I didn't want to have to plane down that resawn 2x4 wood down to 1/4 inch. So to join the face frames of the drawers and cabinet doors together, I'm using dominoes here to help me with the alignment to keep them nice and flat as they come together, using wood glue and dominoes and clamp pressure. And there really are a bunch of different ways to assemble these. You can use brad nails or tongue and groove potentially on the edges, but there are a number of options out there. So one thing I'll say about using 2x4 material is it's a perfect excuse to get out of your comfort zone and try different woodworking techniques. If there are mistakes, it's so affordable and you're not going to waste hundreds of dollars in hardwood. And also, in my opinion, not a bad place to use it because it's going to be sitting in the shop versus being front and center in the kitchen or something like that. So for my smaller drawer faces, I didn't have a mortising bit that was small enough to fit in these little frame pieces. So I'm just going with the old tape trick here, basically where you put a piece of tape on all the mitered corners, add some glue, and then fold it together using some pressure from that tape to keep the joint together as the glue dries. I'm using a pin nailer here just to make sure that it stays in place, but not totally necessary. There were a few cases where after putting the pieces together they didn't align perfectly and had a couple cracks, so I'm just putting in some makeshift wood filler here using glue and sawdust. After all the glue dried, I took them out and gave everything a nice sanding with 120 grit. Next it was time to work on the panels for the drawers and the doors. So as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to be using the other side of the resawn 2x4s. So these were resawn at about 1/2 inch, or planed down to 1/2 inch. And I'm going to glue up a larger section for the cabinet doors. So I'm just using some parallel clamps, some glue, and I'm also bringing in some of these straight boards here to keep the boards straight while the glue dries. So using clamps on those white boards, and also some parallel clamps and pipe clamps just to hold everything together. Also wiping up the glue while it dries. I'm also doing some smaller glue ups for the actual drawer panels, which are slightly wider than the 2x4. So initially after the glue up, the panel seemed to be pretty straight, and it's a little too wide for my planer, so I'm gonna take an electric hand plane here and just gonna knock down some of those edges and lips that were left over after the glue up and the board's shifting a little bit. I'm gonna fill any major holes with some super glue and then just some activator there to harden it up. And then just gonna hit it with some 120 grit sandpaper with my random orbital sander. So after cleaning everything up, I am cutting out the panels for the doors. Yeah, it's just too much. I'm not totally sure what caused the panels to bow so much after the fact, but I think a lot of it had to do with, again, some residual moisture in the 2x4, and then also the panels being so thin. It was hard to have enough surface area to keep the joint nice and sturdy. But I ended up repurposing those for my drawer panels, just ripping them down to the widths and lengths that I needed to fit within my drawer face frames. I was pretty happy with how everything came out, all things considered, using 2x4 wood. My solution for the door panel is pretty simple. I just ended up going with some 1/2 inch plywood. And with that, every piece has been cut out, so now it was time to get some stain on there. To prep for stain, I vacuum every piece and then also wipe the boards down with some mineral spirits and a paper towel just to get any residual dust off there. And I'm a fan of this pre-stained wood conditioner. It really helps the stain to soak in and go on nice and even. So I always put a coat of this on first and let it dry for about 15 minutes or so, and then I put on the actual wood stain, which in this case I'm going with this bare natural wood stain color. Really just pretty simple for staining. It's just kind of a wipe on, let it soak in for a minute, and then wipe off any excess that didn't soak in. I'm also going to be staining the panels black. Same process as the natural wood stain. Pretty critical in this one to wipe off the excess as well so it doesn't gummy up and get blotchy. And I'm doing just one coat for both the black and the natural wood color. And in my opinion, the stain looks pretty good on the 2x4. It soaks in nice. Now for the tricky part here. I wanted black stain in those little V channels that I cut out earlier. So I'm using a syringe, which has multiple purposes, as a stain applicant here. And I am first putting on an initial load into the groove, and then I'm using the actual end of the needle on the syringe to kind of wipe it in there and get it to extend all the way to the edges of the V groove. Not an exact science, but I thought it went on pretty good. So when I initially had the stain in there, it seemed to be in the grooves pretty good, but after letting the stain sit in there for a little while, I noticed that it was soaking into the adjacent wood on the front of the frame, so I ended up having to sand it back down and re-stain that natural wood part on the face, which really wasn't a ton of rework. If I had gone back to do it, I probably would have done the black first and then sanded that down and then just stained, so a little bit extra rework here, but not too bad. And with that, all the staining was done. Went pretty quick, and I'm pretty happy with the result. Took a little bit extra work, but not bad. To get the panels just secured into the frames, I am using a pneumatic stapler and just gonna have some staples straddle the panel and the frame just to secure it in place. You're not gonna see those staples anyway, since they're just gonna be mounted onto the drawers themselves. And then for the plywood panels that I had earlier that are gonna go for the cabinet doors, I'm just gonna use some pocket holes here to secure it to the face frame. If I was building these doors for, let's say, a kitchen or some kind of interior cabinet, probably would have put some extra effort into making the backs of the doors look good, but What are you gonna do with shop cabinets? Now I'm just gonna use this Craig concealed hinge jig to help me bore out the holes for the cabinet hinges, and also using this hardware jig to get consistent holes cut out for my drawer hardware. Both of these jigs are pretty helpful. I would say if you're on a budget, unnecessary, you could probably do it without those, but again, helps to have that tool to make things more consistent and speed up the process. Final step here is to get some finish on these, so I'm going to go with some lacquer. This is pre-cat gloss lacquer, and I'm just going to thin it down a little bit with some distilled water, about 5-10% or so. Just helps the lacquer to set up and not gob on as much. I'm using this Fuji HVLP sprayer. I really think spraying lacquer gets a better finish than brushing lacquer, and also gets done way faster. After the first coat goes on, I'm going to sand using this 320 sanding sponge, and going to just do a nice light sand on there to break up any of the nubs and stuff that stick up after the lacquer goes on. And I'm going to vacuum all that sanding dust off and wipe it off with a rag before I apply the next coat. And I ended up doing 3 coats in total, sanding in between the first and second coat, and doing a very, very light sand after the third coat. So here are my final thoughts on using 2x4s for a project like this. I'm actually really happy with how it came out. I think the project looks great, and I think the nuts give it some really cool character. But it was a ton of work to get the boards to look like that. A lot of milling and remilling because of the moisture that was in the wood. And there were also definitely instances where I had some wood waste because the knots were just too much and the boards were starting to break apart when I got them a little thinner. So if I was building something nicer like kitchen cabinets or a dining room table, obviously I would go with hardwood there. They're going to be more durable and just generally a little easier to work with. But for something like this that's going to be in the shop and it's going to get beat up anyway, I think it was a great option. And if you have the tools and the patience to mill up the wood, then not your worst option. And I'd probably use it in the future for something like this. But please leave me a comment and let me know your thoughts on using 2x4s for furniture. And if you enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing and also liking the video, which really helps out the algorithm and helps to get views on a smaller channel like this. So appreciate it, and we'll see you on the next one.